Week 3 is done. Time for a hydration break and a look at the games. First game we're going to look at is Mike versus Red. E4, E5, Knight F3, Knight C6, Bishop C4, putting pressure on that F7 pawn, Bishop C5, putting pressure back on the F2 pawn. C3, this helps prepare this advance in the center to push D4. And then Knight F6, attacking the central pawn. Get D4 anyway, we get an exchange, and then check to the white king. And this right here will take a quick second because both players have played excellent in the opening. This is a very classical opening position that can happen. And there's so many tactical possibilities here. It's a very tactical opening. White's got these two pawns in the center. Black has 3 pieces out versus the 2. So both players have something that they have going for them. And to show some interesting ideas that are inside here, you could actually block this check with the bishop here. And then if, say, black came in and grabbed the pawn, you could snag the bishop, knight recaptures, bring the queen out. You're now putting pressure onto this pawn over here. Black would have to defend, and probably you'd castle out of the center and play the position from here. And I think this is a wild position that you could get into very easily from that position there. So just to show like some of the tactical ideas that are available inside, that are just hanging out inside the position. You have the knight coming out to block the check instead. Nothing wrong with that. And castling, a very smart and practical move. Gets the king out of the center, gets ready to bring the rook over. And then bishop d2 to try to break the pin on the knight that is defending this pawn. Probably a bit simpler is to just castle if black wants to snag that pawn. You can go ahead and let them. You have control of the center. It's going to be hard. You can probably push this pawn and break things up and play from here. It's definitely a very rich position here. Maybe you can bring the queen over, set up some batteries along here. You have some attacking ideas available for the pawns. You're trading that pawn in for initiative there. Bishop d2 though, and black does a great job of finding a sequence. And I noticed looking at the time that you can see between capturing and this move is spend a minute, and then the next few moves kind of come in a flurry. And I think it shows like a good set of calculation by black for these next few moves. So they take the knight, recapture the pawn, and then snagging the pawn here. And now that the king is out of the center, there's no pressure that you can put along this file. If the king was located on the square, this open file would be pretty deadly. White castles out of the center, and then d5, very smart move, pushing, anchoring the knight in, and then pushing this bishop back. Bishop comes back to d3, putting pressure on the knight. And the next few moves, what's interesting about from black's moves is that they all are designed to support this knight in the center. So this rook comes over to put pressure on the knight, bishop comes over, helps defend the knight, and then this rook comes over, attacking the pawn over here. One thing from white, you could consider bringing the queen over. You're putting pressure along this diagonal. I'm not sure what the best continuation for black is. I mean, I can look at the computer and see that, but I would say from a human's perspective, trying to figure out what to do about this bishop, you got lots of pressure on here. It's still a battle. It's a battle between what's happening on this center square. Knight comes over, or the rook comes over to attack the pawn, defends it, and then the bishop comes out trying to attack the queen and gets pushed back, and then white goes all in on the tactics, hoping to find something to hitting this, counterattacking this bishop here. Unfortunately, black finds a beautiful sequence to essentially seal the game away. The fork, the 2 pieces, queen moves out of the way, picks up the rook. We get an exchange. Bishop comes back, trying to get out of this line here. I was looking at this to try to find if there was some tricks that you could do. You might be able to go for taking and maybe something like this, then black probably blocks. So it's a hard position either way. The bishop comes back, stops any back rank checkmates, picks up the free bishop. We get an exchange. The knight comes out, a good move, attacking the queen, attacking the bishop. We get a check, and then we get some exchanges here. And at this point, black is up too much material and is able to convert the bishop. But this position here, just earlier in the game, where you have all this tension between the pieces, this is a great opening to look at and just see like this battle for the center, and really well done by black to convert that. The next game we're going to look at is between Kaz and Rob. This is another e4, e5 battle, and I thought it would be interesting to look at this one compared to the previous game that we just saw. So at e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and then queen e7, bringing the queen out into the center here and blocking in the development of this bishop that would like to go to. Castle, d6, d3, and then bishop c6. And once I saw this move, I figured out what was the idea behind this queen e7 move. It's to get this bishop to here, and then expecting an exchange here where you would end up with a position where, you know, your queen is recaptured. You've eliminated this bishop that was sitting over here, and you haven't doubled your pawns or ruined your structure at all. King could castle, and you would be fine. I believe what might be, and I'm going on an assumption here, but one of the challenges that you can run into when you play these symmetrical e-pawn games is if you develop the knight to here, and then white comes forward with their knight, attacking this pawn. You're forced to push the d-pawn forward. They recapture, you recapture here. They come in and capture that pawn. You capture back. And then you get this check from the queen, and it's a very, very tricky position to play. And then you go and you try to hide your king, and then next thing you know, you're getting checkmated on the diagonal here. Not that those are forced moves or anything like that, but definitely at a beginner level, you can run into this fried liver attack, and it can be pretty challenging and difficult to deal with. You know, once this knight comes forward and starts attacking this pawn here. So by bringing the queen and delaying that and trying to get this bishop out to here, you're trying to eliminate any possibility of this square becoming weak. One thing, if you did want to go down that line, if you did want to just try to trade this bishop off as fast as possible, you can just play d6 directly, and then the castle, you can bring your bishop out and not be too worried about this double pawn structure. This actually is not anything challenging for black to handle, having this extra pawn here. In fact, this pawn controls some important squares and lets you advance into the center. So it's actually okay to go for this. So I think if you're going to go for this line of trying to get a bishop here in order to challenge, I would just go straight forward and not worry about bringing the queen forward. Conversely, you can also go for, like the previous game we saw, bringing the bishop out. And then if you do want to go for this line and you're worried about this move, it's just important to know that taking this way is very challenging, but you can also just bring the knight over to here, and you can get to another very tactical and very interesting rich position. But this is like an alternative that should be fine for black. So I'm going on the assumption that this is one of the main ideas that black was trying to avoid. For white, if you have this option of pushing d4, do it right away. If you were able to get this kind of exchange, you'd be feeling very good in this position here. You've got control of the center. your queen is ideally placed. There's nothing that can challenge it. That would be another way of approaching the position. Nothing wrong with d3. Bishop comes out, and then we get the bishop to g5, attacking the queen, and then blocking that, and then bring it back. And white's playing very logically, getting pieces out, getting the pawns open, whereas black, I think, is running into a little bit of issue here with these pieces all kind of jumbled together. It's hard to get, this knight can't go to the natural square. It'd have to come this way. The bishop doesn't have anywhere to go to, so it's hard for black to continue the development of the position right now. Castling, which at least gets the king out of the center. Again, white being very principled, bringing another piece out, so white has all 4 of their minor pieces out into the game. Pawn move, at least trying to find a way for this bishop to get into the game somehow. And then the knight jumps into the center. Very logical. Once you have this lead in development, you can start jumping your pieces into the opponent's position. Again, exchange, capturing the pawn. Very, pretty wise move. More natural would be for most people to capture this way, but it's actually more. It's the more accurate move to capture with the pawn. So good job from white finding that move. You get the knight jumping forward. And we get an exchange, and now you can start to see that with white's the only one that has any pieces out after those exchanges of the other pieces that were in the game. And you have an open file. You have a lot of pressure with these bishops pointing over into the king side, and white does a good job of finding some ways to starts picking off pawns. Pawn moves forward. This is always a good one to know, that you might be able to trap the bishop that sneaks in too far. Unfortunately, white has a good response with the other bishop coming in to support. Get a check. Pawn goes forward. And good job of not panicking when the rook came over. That does look like black has got great opportunity to pick up some material over here that's been trapped, but unfortunately this king is just too weak in the position. Get checked, the king drops back, and now these rooks are also connected, which allows the rook to slide over. Good job sliding the rook that was doing nothing over in the corner there. Queen comes over, covering some space, but then the bishop comes counterattacking the queen, and then when the queen moves, we get a nice checkmate into the back rank there. Now we're going to take a look at some d4, d5 games. First one's Victor versus Ty. d4, d5, c4, Queen's Gambit. Very old school opening. Made a Netflix series about it. Knight f6. This move's a little bit inaccurate. e6 is a little bit more precise in this position. If you're playing from the white side and you see your opponent make this knight f6 move, you have this option of capturing. When they capture back, you can hit the knight and drive it to some other square. It'll have to retreat somewhere, and you've now gotten control of the center. So an option that's available to white in this position. But bringing the knight out, nothing wrong with developing. And bishop comes over. We bring the knight out to f3. Pawn goes forward, and then brings the bishop out to f4. One option you have from the white side is bringing this queen out to b3. You start to put pressure onto the center, put pressure onto the b7 pawn, and the queen's actually pretty safe and stands well on this position. It's stopping this bishop from developing this way, as we'll see later. That kind of plays a role in the game, and I think just seeing this, like once you move the c pawn forward, you always have this option of developing the queen out to the side here, and that can actually be very advantageous to bring your queen out. This is one of those situations where bringing your queen forward early is okay. It's a little bit different from other situations where you see people bringing the queen forward. This square is not going to be used by any other piece. Only the queen would be sitting here, and it's also not in a situation where it could be exposed to counterattack from the opponent's pieces. Bishop comes out and pins, a3 attacking the bishop, which kind of forces the bishop to do what it was planning on doing anyway. And that can lead to, that could be a bit of a loss of tempo here, since you're just using this pawn to encourage the bishop to take. There's not really any, you don't have any other plans to defend that. You could again bring the queen out to here. Now you always have the option of even capturing this way and maintaining your structure if you're worried about that, or if this exchange happened, now your queen is defending these pawns in the center. With this exchange of the knight, then the e4 square is now open, and black takes advantage of that by jumping the knight in. We get e3, and then black pushes the c5 square, putting as much pressure as possible into the center. So all these pawns are in total tension. The knight and the bishop are standing pretty aggressively for black. So black is playing a very forward and aggressive opening. Both sides are totally fine. Actually, we can turn on the engine here so you can see the evaluation. So both sides are playing well. And let's take a look at the next moves. Bishop e2. Probably at this point, if you're on the white side, you should be thinking about maybe exchanging off some of the tension in the middle. If you exchange that pawn, this pawn's no longer an issue. You actually open up more squares for this bishop to come out to, and you start to weaken the black center a little bit. You start to have some options yourself in this position. You get castle, and now black goes forward and cashes in on the loose pawn. Queen comes up, getting out of the attack. This does fork the two pieces together. So black takes the bishop, and then finds this interesting idea of pushing the pawn on b5 forward. The pawn is not protected, but as we can see, the pawn gets taken, and then black advances this pawn c forward. And this is a creative idea to get a protected passed pawn in the position. This pawn chain is very, very strong. A rook could slide over behind the pawn at some point. The queen could come out to some squares and maybe put pressure on the pawns over here. So black has a lot of possibilities for the sacrifice pawn, and is in control of the position right now with the pawn structure, with the strong pawn chain. Knight jumps forward into e5, and then black moves the bishop down, which has a strong attack and idea. It does leave the knight could jump back and exchange, and at this point white would actually be the one in charge. They now have the extra pawn. They have the more space on the queen side, and then the rooks would come over. This bishop's now supporting it. So it's one of those situations where the position could have flipped around very quickly. I think from the black side, you need to build slower. I'm guessing Peter wants f6. I'd be looking at probably just trying to bring the knight into the game. Computer doesn't love it necessarily, but I think this makes sense to just continue to develop. You now have that idea of exchanging this off and anchoring that bishop there. But white misses the idea of bringing the knight retreat. The knight was covering that square. It's sometimes a hard move to see these knight retreats. Instead, goes forward with the queen, getting it out of the way, and then black cashes in on the bishop on f1, or on the rook, sorry, on f1. Going for checkmate. You never know. Maybe your opponent will miss it, but black does a good job bringing the queen up, which also attacks the bishop over here. And bishop comes back, attacking the queen, and then this is a very creative move. This is probably not a move I would have necessarily seen, or at least not seen right away. It does force the liquidation of a lot of material in the game. Bringing the bishop back, so the bishop is now no longer being threatened on that square. It's now counterattacking the queen. So we have this tension here. If white took the bishop, then you would capture this bishop, and you'd still be up a rook. Instead, white goes for capturing the capturing the queen. Queen gets captured. Bishop gets picked up, but now the pawn is free to move and picks up the bishop there. And now at this point, black is up a rook and just needs to get their pieces out. So good job getting the knight into the game, and the extra material should decide the game. Starts pushing the pawns, so watch the rook endgame class from last week. Brings the knight to a good square and hops the knight into the position, attacks the pawn. White really doesn't have many other options other than push things forward and hope for the best. Pushing the pawn forward. I don't know if there's anything wrong with just snagging a free pawn. I would probably just grab material, but I'm greedy like that. Push the pawn forward. Rook has to come forward to stop it, and then the knight retreats. Again, I think you can still go grab that one, but nothing wrong with retreating and making sure that this pawn is covered. White trying to find ways to attack the pawn. If they could clean it up, maybe there's something they could do. Rook comes over, now attacking that pawn. King to the defense, double the rooks. Got full power on the file here. The rook slides over to try to infiltrate into the position. Knight picks up the pawn. This always is going to lead into a tricky position with the rook and the knight pinned to each other. King comes over to try to defend the pieces, but now the knight comes in with check. And a few more moves, and snags the rook and slides the rook over. This rook is going to eat all these pawns. There's nothing for white to do at this point, and white resigned the game. Let's finish things off with another d4, d5. This one between Jerrod and Felipe. d4, d5, c4, queen's gambit, and then we get this Albin counter gambit. One of the things that I think is so fascinating about chess is so many moves are possible, like in the beginning of the game. There's so many possible openings and strategies that you can play, and I think this is a good example where you just move the pawn. It can be taken for free. It's still a viable opening for black, and there's a lot of spiciness inside of it. Brings the knight out, brings the bishop out. Both sides are developing pretty logically. You'll see the bar go up over here. That's purely from a tactical little sequence that could happen where you could take this pawn. Black would have to recapture, then you would hit the bishop. It's now defended by this knight here. Bishop retreats, and then you move the pawn forward, forking both the pieces there. It's not immediately obvious from this move that that's a possibility that's inside there, but definitely one of those things of keeping an eye of whatever your captures are possible in the position is always a good idea. Instead, you get taking the pawn. The pawn is defended by the knight, so should be a free pawn, and recaptures this way. So both sides trade. Queens come off, and continuing to develop, putting pressure onto the knight in the diagonal. Both sides develop. This will damage white's pawn structure by taking the bishop, or by taking the knight here, taking with the bishop, and then castles. So both sides have played pretty logically. We've gotten both the materials all even. Both sides have their pieces out. King's castled. And let's see what happens next. So bringing this bishop to a great diagonal, putting pressure along this long diagonal, pinning the knight here. And logically, black moves out to break the pin, and now attacking the piece. And white has been employing a pretty direct strategy. They've been playing very, very quickly. Only 1 minute played so far versus 2 minutes for black, so both players have been playing pretty fast. But white is continuing to just find, like, I'm going to make a threat, I'm going to make threats. And while there can be risk to that strategy of moving fast and creating those threats, on the other hand, it does put pressure on your opponent. So it is a very viable strategy to employ. But does leave that pawn hanging in the middle. So good job from black from seeing that and picking that up. But we now have a position with white picking up that bishop there. We have two knights versus two bishops, and those two bishops can be difficult to deal with. But immediately trades one of them off, and then hits out and hits this knight here. And this is one of those positions where black retreats the knight. And I think just taking an extra, whenever your opponent's playing quickly, I think as on the defender, like if your opponent's putting a lot of pressure and always kind of attacking your position, you need to find like where are those resources in your position. And this knight has it has 8 different squares that it can move to. And if you look, well, this one's occupied, so it can't move to that one. So it has 7 squares that are available. These 2 are right out because you would just lose the piece right away. So you have all of these squares that you have to consider from. And if you spend a little bit of time looking at this, you should be able to find that this move here is just puts your knight into such a great position and really forces white to figure out what to do next. For example, if they exchange, you just bring your rook down. They bring the rook over, you bring your rook over here. You'll never ending up in a situation where you're not just getting a very dominant position with that knight there. If they try to move the bishop somewhere to attack, you can always just block that diagonal there. You know, for example, there's just no way for, and this equalizes things, of course, because I hang that pawn right there. Actually, this pawn's not even hanging because the rook is doing a good job defending it. But anyway, the point is that you get this knight into this position. You're now you're controlling the situation, and white shouldn't have any other real counterattacking chances, and you can start to build the game for yourself behind it. But instead, the knight retreats, which then allows white to pick up the undefended pawn, and you're also putting pressure along this diagonal here, which is hard to deal with. Black tries to build a little pawn chain over here to push this bishop back, but good job on white maintaining not that diagonal, but this diagonal here. And then moves out of the way. I was curious if you could push forward with the idea, like if you could get this pawn forward to here, you're now locking this bishop out of the game, and then if they move their own pawn forward, you could just lock it out, and now this bishop doesn't have the same pressure on the position there. So that'd be something I would be looking at, is just, so you started building this pawn chain over here, just continue with that strategy and building that pawn chain up. But the king moves out of the way, which allows this pawn to move. There is always this threat, I guess, in this position about what to do if the pawn moved forward. I think you can just move the knight back and you defend the pawn and you get the knight out of trouble, but it's a hard move to see. So the king moves out of the way, rook comes over, challenging the file, and this puts black into a tricky position here. Yeah, it looks like the only real hold is to, move the rook to some other square and not initiate any trades. Black trades, and now this gives white the full reign. The rook has full control over this position, trying to give this king some escape, but then the rook comes back and checks anyway, and then pinning the knight. A good job from white finding all these tactical ideas of the pins and ways of putting pressure onto the position. King moves out to break the pin, king moves up, and then we get the knight gets attacked, and with this pawn move here, the last escape square for the knight was removed. And it's a good job from white to recognize that if, say, they'd done anything else, and then this pawn had come forward. For one, you could always just take it. But also, even if you couldn't take it for some reason, you actually have that square still available for the knight. But when the pawn moved forward, the knight was now trapped, and white is finding these tactics in record time. Now the pawn comes forward, but it's too late. The pawn gets taken. King's in trouble. Gets some checks. Picks up the pawn. And white does a good job of corralling the black king and checkmating in the center of the board there. Here are the standings after 3 weeks. We got 4 players with perfect records, and they'll be facing off in week 4. Let's see what happens in a week. I'll see you all back here.